On the 22nd of December, 2010, in a small office at 236 Massachusetts Avenue Northeast in Washington, D.C., the paperwork looks harmless. Printouts of international reporting, a technical brief, a chart of centrifuge counts at a place most readers have never seen, Natanz. A researcher flips pages with the careful impatience of someone trying to make numbers confess. The gesture is ordinary, aligning staples, smoothing a wrinkled margin, capping a USB drive before setting it down again. But the subject is not ordinary. The pages describe machines failing in patterns that don't read like wear. They read like instruction. In later analysis, the culprit would be framed as malware Stuxnet built to impersonate legitimacy long enough to reach industrial control equipment and quietly force it to misbehave. Attribution would remain officially unclaimed. What is clear is the tone of the evidence. Calm, procedural, and edged with something harder to measure. A program can succeed and still leave a cost. On the 20th of January, 2009, the public rituals in Washington were bright motorcades, oaths, crowds along the National Mall. But the most consequential work moved in the opposite direction. Inward, classified, and built to leave no fingerprints. The new president received briefings that day on matters the cameras would never capture. Among them, according to later investigative reporting by David Sanger in the New York Times, was a covert cyber operation aimed at Iran's uranium enrichment program. The program had begun under George W. Bush and would continue expanded under Barack Obama, precisely because it promised delay without airstrikes. The public record of this effort is not a declassified cable trail. It is the convergence of investigative accounts citing unnamed officials, paired with technical evidence that the weapon existed and worked. The cover begins here. Not a false passport, but a policy premise plausible deniability as strategy. By 2009, the Iranian nuclear file had hardened into a test of patience. Sanctions accumulated, negotiations stalled, threats were exchanged. Israel debated kinetic options, air raids against hardened facilities buried beneath desert rock. The attraction of sabotage was its ambiguity, effects without signatures, damage without declarations of war. In interviews years later, former officials described a calculation. If enrichment could be slowed without bombing, the risk of regional conflagration might be deferred. The logic was cold, procedural. It assumed that a computer worm could accomplish what diplomacy had not, buying time for an outcome that remained undefined. The first deception is procedural, doing violence while keeping the room quiet. There is no declaration, no uniformed combatant, no crater to photograph. Only a gradual accumulation of failed equipment, explained away as maintenance problems, operator error, or the ordinary entropy of complex machines. The weapon's disguise would not be rhetorical. It would be cryptographic. On the 16th of July, 2010, far from Natanz, a different kind of alarm rang. The certificate authority VeriSign revoked a legitimate digital certificate associated with Realtek Semiconductor, a Taiwanese company that manufactured audio chips and network components after security researchers discovered it had been used to sign malicious software. The certificate had authenticated Stuxnet's driver components, allowing them to install on Windows systems without triggering standard warnings. A second certificate, from J Micron Technology, another Taiwanese firm, was later found serving the same purpose. Technical analysis by Symantec, ESET, and other security firms described how these stolen certificates functioned as part of Stuxnet's concealment architecture. When an operating system encounters a driver signed with a valid certificate from a known hardware vendor, it relaxes. The signature says, "This code is trusted." The signature says, "Someone with authority vouches for this." The theft of these certificates, how it was accomplished, by whom remains officially unconfirmed. What is documented is the effect. Stuxnet wore a trusted badge, and systems let it pass. The legend here is mechanical. In human intelligence operations, the legend is the constructed biography that protects the operative. the teacher in Damascus, the businessman in Vienna, the retiree tending roses in a quiet suburb. The legend makes the operative invisible by making them ordinary. For Stuxnet, the legend was cryptographic. A signed driver is ordinary. Millions of them exist. The signature does not announce intention. It announces provenance, and provenance is assumed to be benign. In human operations, the legend protects the operative. Here, the legend protects the code, and the humans behind it remain undisclosed. A trusted signature gets you into the building. It does not tell you which room to destroy. That specificity would come later, encoded in the payload's targeting logic, waiting for the right configuration to reveal itself. In mid-June of 2010, the story became unmanageable in the way covert programs fear most. It touched outsiders. Sergei Ulasen, an antivirus researcher at Virus Blockade, a small Belarusian security firm, encountered anomalous behavior on a client's computer. The machine was rebooting repeatedly without explanation. Investigating, Ulasen and his colleagues identified a previously unknown Windows vulnerability, a flaw in how the operating system handled shortcut files being exploited by malware that appeared unlike anything in their databases. On the 17th of June, 2010, Virus Blockade posted its findings to a security forum, describing the unusual specimen and requesting assistance from the broader research community. The case's public trail begins not with a confession, but with detection. Within weeks, samples had been shared, analyzed, dissected. Researchers at Symantec began documenting the malware's complexity, its multiple propagation methods, its encrypted payloads, its 4 separate zero-day exploits targeting Windows systems. The initial assessment focused on the worm's spread, but something else emerged from the code. A payload aimed at specific industrial control systems manufactured by Siemens. This was not a banking Trojan. This was not ransomware. This was something built to reach machines that most malware ignores. What matters is the shift in custody. Once the sample leaves the target environment, once it's in the hands of analysts who are not part of the plan, control becomes statistical. Every replicated copy is a new witness. Every security researcher who downloads the specimen adds to a decentralized investigation no government can stop. Covert action depends on containment. Malware depends on propagation to reach its target. Those logics can coexist until they can't. The worm had a payload, but first it had to find a very specific kind of silence. Machines running particular software, connected to particular controllers, configured in particular ways. The hunt had begun, and so had its unraveling. By late 2010, attention narrowed onto a single underground geography, the enrichment facility near Natanz, in Iran's Isfahan province. The International Atomic Energy Agency had monitored the facility for years, publishing quarterly reports that tracked the number of centrifuges installed, the number operating, and the amount of enriched uranium produced. Analysts studying these reports noticed discrepancies patterns, suggesting that machines were being replaced at rates inconsistent with normal wear. The Institute for Science and International Security, led by former weapons inspector David Albright, published assessments estimating that Iran had decommissioned roughly 1,000 IR-1 centrifuges between late 2009 and early 2010. The cause remained disputed, but the timing aligned. Natanz is not visible from the road. The enrichment halls are buried beneath meters of concrete and earth, shielded from aerial surveillance and protected by air defense systems. The centrifuges themselves, IR-1 models based on Pakistani designs derived from stolen Dutch technology, spin at supersonic speeds, separating uranium isotopes through minute differences in mass. The process is delicate. Centrifuges are fragile machines, sensitive to vibration, temperature fluctuation, and operating speed. Small deviations accumulate into failure. The target's routine is industrial: motors, frequency converters, control systems, maintenance cycles. Stuxnet's design becomes legible as a hunter's patience. The malware did not immediately destroy machines, it observed. It waited. It confirmed that it had reached the correct configuration, the right PLCs, the right software versions, the right frequency converters manufactured by specific vendors in Iran and Finland. Only then did it act. The target is not a person. The target is confidence in instrumentation. If operators cannot trust their readings, they cannot optimize their processes. If managers cannot explain failures, they cannot plan replacements. Sabotage succeeds when it forces replacement faster than the system can explain. The numbers drifted, then dropped, then got replaced, and the questions multiplied. On the 29th of November, 2010, in Tehran, President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad stood before reporters and acknowledged what Western analysts had suspected for months. "They succeeded in creating problems for a limited number of our centrifuges," he said, with the software they had installed in electronic parts. The admission was careful, framed in technical language that conceded impact without surrendering control of the narrative. Ahmadinejad did not name Stuxnet. He did not identify the attackers. He described the disruption as limited and the damage as contained. Iranian officials had the situation in hand, he implied. The line matters because it is a leader's language pressed into a narrow opening. To admit interference is to acknowledge vulnerability, a difficult concession for a government that had consistently proclaimed the invincibility of its nuclear program against Western pressure. But to deny interference entirely was becoming untenable. Too many journalists were asking questions. Too many technical reports were circulating. The worm had been named, dissected, attributed in speculation, if not in official statement. This chapter's moral context is not only Iran's. It is the attacker's wager, that a targeted state will hesitate to admit it has been penetrated, because admission itself is reputational damage. A government that cannot protect its most sensitive facilities from malware, what else can it not protect? The silence of the victim is part of the attacker's camouflage. Every week that passes without acknowledgement is a week the operation continues unobserved by the public. In covert conflict, the victim's pride is part of the attacker's concealment. Ahmadinejad's admission broke that pattern, but only partially. The next step was not to prove a virus existed. That was already established. The next step was to prove it could touch steel, could reach into the physical world, could make machines break while their operators watched and understood nothing. By early 2011, public analysis emphasized apparent recovery at Natanz. Iran replaced damaged centrifuges. Enrichment continued. IAEA reports showed production resuming, stockpiles growing. Whatever damage Stuxnet had inflicted, it had not stopped the program. Some analysts argued the sabotage had delayed Iran's nuclear ambitions by months or years. Others suggested the effect was temporary, a setback overcome by persistence and redundancy. The truth remained obscured behind classification on one side and secrecy on the other. Much of what outsiders know about Natanz is behavior inferred from reporting rather than direct observation. Journalists and researchers cannot enter the cascade halls. They cannot interview the technicians who maintain the centrifuges or inspect the equipment that failed. The IAEA has access, but its reports are technical, cautious, and constrained by diplomatic protocols. What remains visible is pattern, disruption, replacement, continuation. The numbers in the public record centrifuges installed. Centrifuges operating tell a story of institutional resilience, of engineers working to keep a system functioning despite interference they may not fully understand. The target's aura is that resilience itself. It is the belief shared by engineers everywhere that failures are explainable within the system. A centrifuge fails because of a manufacturing defect. A frequency converter malfunctions because of a power surge. A control system behaves erratically because of a software bug. These explanations are ordinary. They do not require conspiracy. Stuxnet's most corrosive effect in this reading is epistemic. It makes every failure suspect. When a system can't trust its own sensors, it starts bleeding attention. Engineers checking equipment that might be fine. managers second-guessing data that might be accurate, technicians wondering if their training prepared them for an adversary they cannot see. The operation didn't need to destroy everything. It only needed to make normal operation feel unreliable. What the cameras don't explain is whether that feeling ever went away. In mid-2010, before Stuxnet's public discovery, early reporting tied the worm's spread to a Windows shortcut vulnerability. CVE 2010-2568 that allowed malicious code to execute merely by viewing a folder containing a specially crafted .lnk file. The exploit was elegant in its simplicity. No clicking required, no user interaction beyond opening a directory. Combined with Stuxnet's ability to copy itself to USB drives, the vulnerability provided a vector perfectly suited to environments disconnected from the internet. Industrial control systems often rely on air gaps, physical separation from networked computers as a security measure. The logic is intuitive. If a machine isn't connected to the internet, it can't be hacked remotely. But air gaps are habits, not walls. They are maintained by policy and convenience, not by physical impossibility. USB drives cross air gaps constantly. Engineers transfer software updates. Technicians move data between systems. Contractors carry files from office to facility. The air gap is a door that opens whenever work moves. This is where the operation's tradecraft becomes narratable to the public, not in spy novels, but in patch advisories and technical write-ups from Microsoft and Siemens. A weapon built to be silent was being described in the language of vulnerabilities and mitigations. CVE 2010-2568 was patched on the 2nd of August, 2010, weeks after Stuxnet's discovery. But by then, the worm had been spreading for months. Some analyses suggested years propagating through networks, waiting on USB drives, seeking the specific configurations it was designed to attack. The recurring motif, a USB drive, cap clicked shut, pocketed, carried across boundaries that policy assumes are closed. The smallest object in the story is also the most mobile. The worm didn't need the internet. It needed a human doing their job, transferring files the way files are always transferred, unaware that they were carrying something designed to break machines they would never see. By late September of 2010, technical dossiers had clarified what made Stuxnet fundamentally different from conventional malware. Ralph Langner, a German industrial control system security consultant, published analysis demonstrating that Stuxnet targeted Siemens S7-300 series programmable logic controllers specifically, those connected to frequency converter drives from particular manufacturers. The targeting was not generic. It was selective to the point of intimacy. Symantec's detailed report, released in updated form throughout late 2010 and 2011, mapped the infection chain. Stuxnet checked for the presence of Siemens Step 7 software, used to program PLCs. If found, it injected malicious code into the project files. When those files were loaded onto a PLC, controlling frequency converters within specific parameters, frequencies matching those used in uranium enrichment, the payload activated. The worm modified the commands sent to the converters, altering motor speeds in timed sequences while simultaneously feeding operators normal-looking values on their monitoring screens. The operation reads like surveillance. Identify an architecture. The public after-action record is technical, assembled by researchers who had no access to classified briefings but could read the code itself. The targeting logic revealed the target as clearly as a fingerprint reveals an identity. Converters operating at frequencies between 807 Hz and 1210 Hz, the range used by IR1 centrifuges. No other industrial process would match those parameters. In kinetic operations, the fear is the wrong address, a bomb falling on a hospital, a raid hitting the wrong building. In cyber-physical sabotage, the fear is the wrong configuration, a payload activating in a water treatment plant or a factory producing consumer goods. Stuxnet's designers built their weapon to be specific. The targeting logic was the insurance policy. But specificity depends on intelligence, on knowing exactly what configuration exists inside a facility you cannot enter. The next question wasn't whether Stuxnet could reach Natanz. It was what it would do once it arrived. As researchers reconstructed the payload through 2010 and 2011, the core intent became mechanical, legible, and disturbing in its patience. Stuxnet targeted frequency converter drives and manipulated their operating parameters in timed sequences. According to Symantec's analysis, the malware would periodically send commands increasing converter output to 1410 Hz, then dropping it to 2 Hz, then returning toward normal operating speeds, all while recording legitimate values to replay for operators watching their screens. The centrifuges would accelerate beyond safe limits, then nearly stop, then resume. The oscillation stressed components designed for steady-state operation. Bearings wore, rotors destabilized. Machines failed. The logic is a loop designed to convert trust into wear. Operators seeing normal values would have no reason to intervene. Maintenance crews finding failed centrifuges would attribute the damage to manufacturing defects or operational stress. The sabotage looked like malfunction. The malfunction looked like bad luck. The pattern repeated across machines, across days, across the silent accumulation of unexplained failures that eventually become statistics in an IAEA report. This chapter stays disciplined. The public record does not name a specific Iranian technician who watched a specific gauge on a specific morning. It does not provide the dialogue of engineers puzzling over inexplicable data. What it provides is method a sabotage routine documented in hexadecimal, reconstructed by analysts who could read the code's intention without ever entering the facility it targeted. The operation is not an explosion. It's a lie told repeatedly to a machine until the machine breaks. The lie is the normal value displayed on the screen. The truth is the motor spinning at the wrong speed, invisible to everyone except the centrifuge itself. Once a centrifuge fails, the first suspect is always the operator. Human error, insufficient training, inadequate attention. The operator becomes the explanation, until the operator realizes they may also be the cover story for something they never knew was happening. In June of 2012, David Sanger of the New York Times published reporting that described the program behind Stuxnet as a joint U.S. Israeli effort proceeding under presidential authorization. The operation, codenamed Olympic Games, according to Sanger's sources, had begun during the Bush administration and continued under Obama, with decisions about specific attacks made in the White House Situation Room. The reporting was based on interviews with current and former officials, conducted over 18 months, and presented the first comprehensive narrative of how the weapon had been developed, deployed, and ultimately exposed. Attribution in this case is not a courtroom fact. No government has officially confirmed involvement. The U.S. Department of Justice launched leak investigations following the Times report. But the journalistic claim documented, sourced to officials, matched against technical evidence of the weapon's sophistication and strategic fit, established a public understanding that has not been meaningfully challenged. Subsequent books, including Sanger's Confront and Conceal and Kim Zetter's Countdown to Zero Day, expanded the record. The reporting also emphasized a decision problem: whether to continue the operation once the malware had been discovered. According to Sanger's account, when Stuxnet escaped Natanz, spreading beyond its intended target due to a modification that made it more aggressive, Obama was informed and chose to proceed. The worm was already in the wild. Recalling it was impossible. The only choices were to accelerate, to pause, or to watch. This is where institutional strain enters the record not as inner monologue, but as the observable stress of governance. The risk of escalation, the fear of precedent, the uneasy knowledge that a tool built for one facility could teach others how to build similar tools. The operative strain is institutional. When a covert action becomes public, every silence becomes suspicious. Every denial rings hollow. The operation had delayed machines. Now it threatened to accelerate history. By early June of 2012, prominent reporting had framed Stuxnet as the work of U.S. and Israeli experts proceeding under secret orders. The New York Times article, other investigative reports, and subsequent books established a narrative that governments never confirmed, but never successfully dispelled. This is the moment the operation acquires a second life, not inside Natanz, but inside institutions that must defend, deny, deter, and adapt. Public acknowledgement remains absent. The state's cover stays intact officially, even as the narrative becomes legible to adversaries, allies, and the public. The immediate fallout is informational. Once the world believes nation-states have crossed into cyber-physical sabotage, have built weapons that can reach through networks, into industrial equipment, and cause physical destruction, restraint becomes harder to sell. If the United States and Israel did this to Iran, the reasoning goes, what prevents Iran from doing it to others? What prevents Russia, China, North Korea? The precedent is not just operational but normative, a demonstration that such attacks are possible, survivable, and perhaps tolerable within the unwritten rules of international conduct. The personal cost, what can be responsibly said without access to classified personnel records, is that decision-makers inherit a precedent they cannot recall. The operation succeeded in its immediate objective. It delayed Iranian enrichment. By some period estimates vary from months to years, depending on the analyst. But it also created a template. The code itself was available for study. The techniques were documented in security reports. The knowledge proliferated. A covert success can still be a strategic leak. The first mission was to slow centrifuges, to buy time for diplomacy, for sanctions, for outcomes that remained uncertain. The second mission, unplanned and unavoidable, was to live with what the method taught everyone else. The weapon had worked. The secret had not survived it. In mid-2012, further reporting framed related malware efforts around Iran as broader than a single tool. Kaspersky Lab and other security firms identified specimens they called Flame, Duquo, and Gauss malware, sharing code similarities or operational patterns with Stuxnet, suggesting a family of tools rather than a single weapon. Flame, in particular, was described as a sophisticated espionage platform capable of recording audio, capturing screenshots, and exfiltrating documents reconnaissance rather than sabotage. Whether every component belongs to one unified plan remains debated. The Washington Post reported in June of 2012 that Flame had been developed jointly by the United States and Israel, citing unnamed officials. Other analysis suggested looser connections, shared libraries, perhaps, or parallel development by different teams. The public record captures the directional truth without resolving every detail. Mapping and sabotage can share a pipeline. Intelligence operations require reconnaissance before action. The tools reflect that sequence. This chapter's moral balance is unresolved. Proponents frame these cyber weapons as alternatives to war, surgical, targeted, less destructive than bombing campaigns that would kill civilians and destabilize the region. Critics frame them as war by other means, acts of aggression against civilian infrastructure, conducted without declaration or accountability, setting precedents that will be used against their creators. Both readings accept the same uncomfortable fact. Code can now reach into physical systems and change outcomes without warning. The operation did not end at the target. It ended when others learned how to imitate it. Iran reportedly accelerated its own cyber capabilities, following Stuxnet's discovery, building units that would later be blamed for attacks on Saudi Aramco, on American banks, on critical infrastructure worldwide. The quietest consequence is not damage, it's imitation. The precedent set by Olympic Games would echo through the decade that followed, in ways its architects may not have anticipated but cannot now prevent. Years later, policy institutions and academic researchers described Olympic Games as among the first known cyber campaigns to cause physical damage to industrial infrastructure. An institutional recognition that a threshold had been crossed, regardless of public admissions. The Tallinn Manual, published by NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, analyzed the legal implications of operations like Stuxnet, without officially attributing them. Think tanks debated proportionality, deterrence, and the risk that covert tools become templates for adversaries. The weapon entered the curriculum of war colleges and the footnotes of international law journals. By that point, Stuxnet was less a single event than a reference point, invoked whenever states argued about the rules of cyber conflict, whenever companies assessed the vulnerability of their industrial systems, whenever policymakers wondered whether sabotage could substitute for diplomacy or war. The specific damage to Natan's 1,000 centrifuges, perhaps, or some other number lost to classification and uncertainty, mattered less than the proof of concept. It could be done. It had been done. It would be done again, by others, for other purposes, with other targets. Return to the motif. A USB drive, capped and pocketed, now not a delivery mechanism but an artifact. Evidence of how the boundary between routine and violence can shrink to something you can lose in a coat pocket, forget in a drawer, carry across borders without knowing what it contains. The first act began with paper and quiet inference, a researcher in Washington reviewing charts of centrifuge counts, trying to make numbers confess. The last act ends the same way. Documents, cautious language, the deliberate absence of names where official records refuse to speak. The story doesn't close with victory. It closes with a method left on the table, available to anyone with the resources and will to use it. In the end, the most enduring payload is the precedent.